بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل والهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Hashiya al-Bajuri, on the al-Sanusiyya, we have reached the rational ruling, right? So we looked at the recap. To recap lesson 4, we looked at the 10 investigations related to the science of Islamic beliefs. And this is very important, right? Now, here the author gave us just a basic framework, right? Just a basic framework. We need to be clear, right? That, we've covered the basmala, the hamdallah, the salawat, and the 10 investigations. So the habit of the seeker of knowledge, anytime they reach a section, that they have a mental recap that, okay, all these things. Can I define the basmala fully? Can I define the hamdallah fully? Can I define the salawat fully, clearly? Right, that's the text. We pointed out related readings to the text that you can expand your understanding of the material from. These 10 investigations, they should give us many questions related to what one would need to understand to fully appreciate the science of theology, the benefits of theology, etc. And one reading that we can include here, bi'idhnillah, is, and we can put it in we'll share it to you in a PDF, is the second section of Qawa'id al-Aqaid of Imam al-Ghazali, which talks about how one studies the science of Aqidah gradually, and some of the things one needs to appreciate about the science of Aqidah, right? In how one begins its study and how one inculcates it in the young. And of course, the same thing applies in our times as well, right? Because many people, and some of it is because they, even if they sometimes study with the mashayikh, but they kind of do their own thing rather than trying to follow the method of the mashayikh, right? So a lot of the advice in that chapter, this relates to this 10 investigations. What are the sources, of the science, and particularly what are the fruits of it, right? The fruits of it is the preservation of faith and the cultivation of faith. And that's something one needs to be aware of for oneself, but also in how one transmits it. And even when there are challenges to faith amongst people, right? The way of the ulama, and Imam al-Ghazali talks about, is that one in teaching Aqidah, one cultivates certitude. One, directly through the means of cultivating certitude, and number two, one gives principles for the wellness of faith, right? Right? This idea of confrontation of issues when it comes to Aqidah is not from the way of the mashayikh classically, right? That there's great harms in sort of bringing the debates with the atheists and so on to the common person, the common believer, even the thoughtful believer. If you ask them, what are you? Say, I'm a Muslim. Even you deal with the common person who may not be that religiously practicing. You ask them, do you believe? Say, yeah. Now, their faith may not be strong, their understanding may not be strong, but the day-to-day person is not actively wondering about atheism. And even if they are, what they need is not the head-to-head confrontation with atheism or with whatever other challenges. It is there's a way. We have not just the way, what we know of the way of prophets in conveying faith, but also we have centuries of, a millennia and centuries of how Aqidah has been taught, cultivated, and transmitted. فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ, as come in the hadith, that نَضَّرَ اللَّهُ امْرَأً, may Allah illuminate the countless one, who hears my words, فَوَعَاهَا, and understands them fully, فَأَدَّاهَا كَمَا سَمِعَ, and who conveys them as they heard them. Right? So this is something the mashayikh would emphasize, right? And Shaykh Adib, with whom I had the honor of studying this text with, was very serious that even for students of knowledge, says, لا تنشغل بالردود, don't busy yourself with refutations. Understand the texts and how they're taught and how they're conveyed, and you will know the answers. Okay? And for the common person, that's why Imam al-Haddad actually gave fatwa that it is not permissible for people to study the Sanusiyya. And that was specific to his time, but for this underlying reason, that when people already do have certitude, they don't have questions about their faith. The general populace in a place like Hadramaut was busy in religious works, even the common person. And there weren't shubuhat and so on around, elements of doubt. What is then? Of course, that fatwa does not necessarily, that's not till the end of times kind of thing, right? Those very scholars now teach these things, but one needs to be aware of this, right? And that's not our purpose in going into the theology. And even the scholars who go in depth, and we'll look at some of the matters related to this when we cover the issue of how we understand the intellect. Okay. So that is something to read upon and reflect upon yourself. Today we're going to begin by looking at the three types of ruling, right? Right? So فقال الإمام al-Sanusi رحمه الله تعالى أن الحكم العقلي, right? ينحصر في ثلاثة أقسام, right? So he says, and know that the rational ruling is divided into three types. So قوله أن الحكم العقلي إلى آخره، قال الشيخ الإسلام الإمام إبراهيم الباجوري رحمه الله تعالى في حاشيته: إنما اقتصر المصنف على الحكم العقلي دون أخويه وهما الحكم العادي والحكم الشرعي لأن الحكم العقلي المحتاج إليه في هذا الفن دونهما. So the author only mentions in the text the rational ruling, not its counterparts, namely the hukm al-adi, the normative ruling, and the legal ruling, the hukm al-shar'i, because it, لأنه أي الحكم العقلي المحتاج إليه, is the one needed in this science. المحتاج إليه أي أصالة, is the one needed, meaning directly. Because what we need in this, the direct purpose of the in Aqidah is to know and accept what is necessary, possible, and impossible with respect to Allah, and likewise with respect to His prophets. Right? In the matters of transmission, we affirm by transmission. So, but we will look at why on some of the issues the hukm al-adi is important to know, insofar as understanding the hukm al-adi is critical in terms of understanding the mumkinat, the possible things, because the possible is governed by the normative, right? And the legal rulings are needed to know insofar as there's the obligation to believe is shar'i, according to the Ash'aris, right? Right? It is. And it is an obligation to believe, full stop, bil ijma'. Right? What is the ruling of al-imanu billah? It's wajib shar'an. Right? So that's why he mentions. So he says, وَحَاصِلُ الْأَمْرِ أَنَّ أَقْسَامَ الْحُكْمِ مِنْ حَيْثُ هُوَ ثَلَاثَةٌ. The summary is that the categories of legal ruling are in of themselves three. And he'll define these for us. Right? So he says, الأول وهو المقصود الحكم العقلي وهو إثبات أمر لأمر أو نفيه عنه من غير توقف على تكرار ولا وضع واضع. Right? So the rational ruling, he gives a definition. The rational ruling is affirming one matter for another, or negating it from it, without depending on repetition, nor the affirmation of one affirming. The affirmation of one affirming, meaning the divine affirmation of a legal ruling, or the ahkam al-wad'iyya. وَيَنْحَصِرُ فِي ثَلَاثَةِ أَقْسَامٍ. And this is limited to three types. كما سيذكره المصنف. Right? The hukm al-aqli is of three types, as will be mentioned. وَالْحُكْمُ الْعَادِي, and the normative ruling. وهو إثبات أمر لأمر أو نفيه عنه بواسطة التكرار. Right? The normative ruling, which is affirming one matter for another, or negating it from it, on the basis of repetition. Right? Right? And there are two additions that we would mention here. بواسطة التكرار مع صحة التخلف. Right? مع صحة التخلف. With recognizing the possibility of it being otherwise. مع صحة التخلف. وعدم التأثير البتة. And with there being no causality affirmed. Right? So you can see that I added this to this definition on the slide, right? Which is as follows. Right? That we have the hukm al-adi, we add two things to the definition. مع صحة التخلف. Right? So affirming one matter for another, or negating it from it. On the basis of repetition. Right? Repetition is the things that you observe. You would have studied this before in previous texts, so we're not going to go into it. Two key additions. One is مع صحة التخلف, with the possibility that it could be otherwise. Right? Because it is only affirmed because it's observed. Rationally, it could be otherwise. Because the hukm al-adi, its asl is, it's jaiz aqlan. It falls under the realm of possible, the matters that are rationally possible. Right? So with the possibility that it be otherwise, that there could be fire without burning. It's possible. They could be the cause without the effect happening. We don't expect it, but it's possible. And without ascribing any causality, right? The غاية ما يفيده الحكم العادي وجود ربط بين السبب والمسبب. All that is affirmed by the حكم العادي is that there is a ربط, there's a connection, there's a relationship between the cause and the effect, such that if we find the cause, we expect the effect. If we don't find the cause, we don't expect the effect. But the affirmation of this observed relationship does not entail causality. Okay? Now, we are morally bound to follow the legal consequences of normative rulings. And we are morally bound by that. So, do we believe the fire burns?
We believe that there's a normative connection between fire and burning.
That doesn't answer the question, though. Does the fire burn?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. No. How? Good. Right? So we say yes and no. Why? Fire burns is what kind of ruling? It's a hukm adi. We affirm it due to observation. Right? And our moral responsibility, our amal relates to, right? Our amal with respect to the things around us relates to the hukm al-adi. Fire burns. But is that the only ruling we affirm for fire? What's the other? If Sidi Abdul Latif came out from doing loads of dhikr, he said, fire does not burn. Would you be correct, Sidi Abdul Latif?
Yes.
But how? What kind of ruling is that?
It doesn't burn in and of itself.
Yeah, so that would be what kind of ruling? Slides? Right, what kind of ruling is that? Anyone? That is the hukm aqli. Right? So the heart looks at creation with the hukm al-aqli. Right? Right? الإيمان متعلق بالحكم العقلي. لا خالق إلا الله. Right? هذا خلق الله. This is the creating of Allah. خلق. Right? This is the creating of Allah, or it is the creation of Allah. Right? And both meanings are true. Right? It's فعل أو أثر فعل. Right? قل كل من عند الله. Say it is all from Allah. That is the heart. The heart relates to the hukm al-aqli, but the limbs act upon the hukm al-adi. So Sidi Abdul Latif comes out from dhikr. Can he walk to the fireplace and say, I'm going to use the fire as my pillow? Of course not. Why? Because the hukm al-adi is that the fire burns, and I'm responsible not to hurt myself. But the hukm al-adi cannot encroach into my heart. Because the heart, siyanatul qalb, is تحقيقه ب لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Right? 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 You guard the heart. Right? Right? صيانة القلب يعني تحقيقه ب لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Right? That there's no ability for anything whatsoever. لا حول لشيء دون الله ولا قوة لشيء دون الله إلا بالله. Right? Right? And that is, right? So this illa billah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the sabab and the musabbab. Allah has created the cause and the effect, and it is Allah who has created this rabt, adi, this normative connection between the cause and the effect. And we deal with causes and effects on that basis. But we don't let it creep in. So that is the it's very important to be clear about that. So he says, right, going back to the normative ruling, right, that وينحصر في أربعة أقسام. Right, so the normative ruling is of 4 types, and this is straightforward, and this is something that you have to accustom yourself to think about, right? Which is that, right? Because the ruling, you can affirm something for something, right? Right? So you have either إثبات أمر لأمر أو نفيه عنه. Right? So you can have ithbat or nafi, you can have affirmation and negation for affirmation or negation. So the possibilities are 4. Affirmation, affirmation, or affirmation, negation, or negation, affirmation, or negation, negation. 4 possibilities. And you need to get used to thinking in this manner. Right? So he says, ربط وجود بوجود. A relationship, a connection of affirmation for affirmation. كربط وجود الشبع بوجود الأكل. Such as the connection of the presence of satiation due to the presence of eating. وربط عدم لعدم أو ربط عدم بعدم. كربط عدم الشبع بعدم الأكل. And the connection of non-affirmation for non-affirmation, such as there being non-satiation due to non-eating. وربط وجود بعدم كربط وجود البرد بعدم الستر. And the relationship of عدم, of non-presence, being connected with ربط وجود بعدم, such as something being present due to something being absent. Such as the relationship of feeling cold as a result of not covering. Right? وربط عدم بوجود, and the connection of عدم for وجود كربط عدم الإحراق بوجود الماء, such as they're not being burning due to the presence of water. So there's a log, said the log did not burn. Why? Because it was wet. Or fire does not burn water because of their natures, right? 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 There's a discussion that the normative ruling, is it affirmed بواسطة التكرار? So if something happens twice, that is for sure tikrar. Right? So you could affirm a rational ruling. Right? So let's say someone came from the mountains, they saw somebody ring the doorbell, the door opened. So they went, rang the doorbell, the door opened. They could there's a rabt adi between ringing doorbell and door opening. Right? But the theologians ask the question that if something happened only once, is it a hukm adi? Or is it? So the reason I mention it is that one of the footnotes, one of the ta'liqat here, that of Allama al-Anbabi, is a little objectionable because, if imagine you went to a mountain tribe and the chief was in a tent. You don't know how to go talk to the chief. It's kind of obvious it's probably the chief because it's the biggest tent. So someone goes, and what they do is they hit the tent on both sides. 7 times here, 7 times there. And they ask a question, and they mention their name, and they enter. What would you do if you want to enter the tent? What would you do? Yeah, you do the same thing. But would you be sure that that's the right thing? No. Right, so there'd be a dhann that if you see a relationship between a cause and an effect, once you would not be sure about it unless it becomes repeated. But you would incline towards there being a possible relationship, like in other types of testing, right? So that's just something to think about. Okay. And this aspect of the hukm al-adi, the normative ruling, we should share as a resource here the Sharh al-Muqaddimat of Imam al-Sanusi, the tahqiq of Ustaz Nizar Hammadi. You're not expected to read the whole thing, but just the muqaddimah related to the ahkam, especially his discussion on the hukm al-adi, is significant. And those who would like to read further as well, you would also benefit from the discussion here of Shaykh al-Hashimi in his Miftah al-Jannah, right? And we can share the section from Miftah al-Jannah as well, right? It's not a long section, just specifically on the hukm al-adi. It's a good discussion. And those of you who have studied the Kharida, you can review the same section. And it comes up, the hukm al-adi comes up when we look at not affirming any causality, any effective causality. We affirm observed causality. There's a ta'thir adi. When they say la ta'thir, they say there's no ta'thir aqli lazim. Right? There's no, if nothing in creation has any effect, meaning it does not have rationally necessary intrinsic effect. That confuses some people, which is why you can say, and the Ash'aris, however, were very clear because they want to emphasize the ma'na al-iman, right? Whereas the fuqaha and the Maturidis take this approach, they affirm causality, right? But the khilaf is not haqiqi because the Maturidis, they're concerned that people not negate moral responsibility. So, but what ta'thir do they affirm? There's a ta'thir adi, a normative causality, which is this rabt, which is this relationship. And the khilaf is not a real khilaf. It's not a real khilaf, right? Okay. Right? So in the normative ruling, this rabt, right? We deny necessary, we deny causality مع عدم التأثير أي التأثير العقلي اللازم, right? That there's a necessary causality, but is there a necessary rational causality? Because the true cause is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if is there an observed causality, which is this rabt, which is this relationship between cause and effect? Of course there is. And right, all of this is summarized in Allah, in so many verses. This is both realities affirmed throughout the Quran, startlingly in the verse, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ لَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى وَمَا رَمَيْتَ خَلْقًا وَإِيجَادًا. You did not throw when you threw, rather it was Allah who threw. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ خَلْقًا وَإِيجَادًا. You did not throw in creating and originating the throwing. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ خَلْقًا وَإِيجَادًا تَأْثِيرًا عَقْلِيًا لازما, with necessary causality. إِذْ رَمَيْت, when you threw, كَسْبًا وَاخْتِيارًا, in acquiring the act and choosing it, right? By directing your created ability, your created will and power towards the action, which you did. Right? So it denies the ijad, but affirms the sabab al-adi, but affirms the normative cause. لكن الله رمى وما رميت إذ رميت لكن الله رمى. But rather it was ultimately Allah who threw. Right? So we affirm both sides of the equation. Right? Okay. So they went offline. I can't see anything. Blank screen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So that's a little bit about the normative ruling, right? And these have important iman consequences, right? That's why we highlighted them a little bit. You can recap the same discussion in Sharh al-Kharid al-Bahiyya, because it comes there, and also in Sharh al-Sawi on the Jawhara, for those of you who took that. Okay. And we've recommended 2 resources to read the related section, just the related section from Sharh al-Muqaddimat of Imam al-Sanusi, and the same section on the Hukm al-Adi from Miftah al-Jannah of Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi, rahimahullah ta'ala. والثالث الحكم الشرعي وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بفعل الشخص من حيث التكليف أو الوضع له. So the legal ruling, right, is the speech of Allah related to a person's actions insofar as either relating to moral responsibility or the ahkam al-wad'iyya, the associated rulings. Right, the associated rulings, which are the rulings associated with the ruling of moral responsibility. So he says, وَيَنْحَصِرُ فِي قِسْمَيْن. وَيَنْحَصِرْ أي الحكم العقلي في قسمين, and it is only of 2 types. Right? But of course, in classical books, when they mention the a fi'l, you have to think, what is the fa'il here? الحكم الشرعي. Right? الأول خطاب في قسمين, you can read it خطاب تكليف or خطابي تكليف, right? بدل or استئناف. I prefer استئناف here. خطاب تكليف وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بفعل الشخص من حيث التكليف. The address of responsibility, which is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala related to a person's actions insofar as moral responsibility. وخطاب وضع وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بفعل الشخص من حيث الوضع. And the حكم الوضعي, the associated rulings, which are the speech of Allah related to the actions of a person insofar as the rulings associated to the person's moral responsibility. And then we're not going to expand a lot on the hukm al-taklifi and the hukm al-wad'i, because its place is the books of usul al-fiqh. Right? So he says, right, وَلِلْأَوَّلِ أي الحكم الشرعي خمسة أقسام. The first, the legal ruling has 5 types. الإيجاب وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بطلب فعل الشيء طلبا جازما. Obligation, which is Allah's speech related to demanding an action with a firm demand. والندب وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بطلب فعل الشيء طلبا غير جازم. And recommendation, which is the same with a command that is not firm, right? i.e. leaves choice, right? Encouragement to do, no sin if left. والتحريم وهو كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بطلب ترك الشيء طلبا جازما. And prohibition, which is the same related to leaving a matter unequivocally. والكراهة ولو خفيفة وهي كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بطلب ترك الشيء طلبا غير جازم. And dislike, even if slight, is the same, but related to leaving a matter not firmly. Right? والإباحة وهي كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بالتخيير بين فعل الشيء وتركه. And permission, which is the speech of Allah related to giving the choice between doing something and not doing it. Right? So you can break this down, right? And we're giving you some diagrams to see how you conceptualize things, but here the kalamullah ta'ala is muta'alliq بالطلب والترك, right? With seeking something from you, seeking from you بطلب فعل أو طلب ترك, seeking that you do something or that you leave something. And between them is al-ibaha, and that's why there's discussion. Is permission under moral responsibility? And the breakdown the Imam al-Bajuri gives is that yes, taklif does relate to the permissible, to the merely permissible as well. So, and then both the talab al-fi'l and talab al-tark are jazim and ghair jazim. Both seeking that you act are firm, which is the obligation, and non-firm, which is the recommendation. And seeking that you leave an action is firm, which is the prohibition, and non-firm, which is the dislike. Right? Which is why there's a beautiful discussion in the Muyassar in Usul al-Fiqh of Shaykh Ibrahim al-Silqini. That's a useful work in Usul al-Fiqh, the Muyassar of Shaykh Ibrahim al-Silqini. In the beginning when he discusses the ahkam, and we can put this there as a resource, the PDF of it. Not that you're expected to read the resource, but just what's of interest, and we can put what page that's on, is just that at the end of a good discussion explaining out the ahkam al-taklifiyya, he says, but the people of spiritual concern see, who's try to live by the dictates of love. The lover only has two commands: do and don't do. Right? Okay. And then you have al-hukm al-wad'i. وللثاني أي الحكم الوضعي 5 أقسام أيضا، وهي كلام الله تعالى المتعلق بكون الشيء سببا أو شرطا أو مانعا أو صحيحا أو فاسدا. Right? That the hukm al-wad'i, the associated rulings, are also 5 types because it is the speech of Allah related to something being a cause or a condition or a preventative, or it being sound or it being unsound, meaning here fasid and batil, in the usul of the jumhur, the fasad and butlan are generally the same. The Hanafis distinguish between it throughout. They're in some contexts, the jumhur distinguishes between fasad and butlan, but that's outside our scope here. وإذا نظرت لكون هذه الخمسة تجري في كل واحد من الخمسة السابقة كانت الجملة 25 قائمة من ضرب 5 في مثلها. And if you looked at each of the 5, i.e. each of the 5 rulings of moral responsibility relate to the 5 rulings of the 5 associated rulings, there are 25 possibilities, 5 by 5. وتوضيح ذلك يطلب من المطولات, and the details of that could be found in the lengthy works, but this is not the purpose of this. You can find, for example, in Hashiya al-Dasuqi, extensive discussions on stuff like this, but it's not the purpose here, and I wouldn't spend time on it. But it's important to know the definition of the hukm al-aqli, the hukm al-shar'i, and the hukm al-wad'i. The hukm al-wad'i is of 5 types. That's it. Right? The Allama Ahmad al-Ujhuri mentions examples, right? that if you'd like to read, there's no harm in that. Okay. So then he says, now we go in part 2 to the hukm al-aqli itself, right? The hukm al-aqli. So he says, Imam al-Sanusi says, الحكم العقلي ينحصر في ثلاثة أقسام. The rational ruling is encompassed by 3 types. اعلم أن الحصر على ثلاثة أقسام. That something being encompassed by another is in 3 ways. Right? So these are how you could classify the relationship between a whole and its and what falls within it. الأول حصر الكلي في جزئياته وضابطه أن يصح الإخبار بالمقسم عن كل قسم من أقسامه كما في حصر الكلمة في الاسم والفعل والحرف إذ يصح أن تقول الاسم كلمة وهكذا. So the first of the ways of dividing the relationship between a category and its parts is the relationship between the kulli and the juz'i. Right? And its criteria is that you can reform, you can talk about you can refer with the kulli with respect to each of its specifics. So, right, so this is a category and the things that fall within the category. The kulli is the category, and each particular within the category, you can refer to it by the name of the category. So he uses the example such as a word, the kalima is divided into ism, fi'l, and harf. So the kulli is the kalima, and each of the particulars, ism, fi'l, and harf, you can say they are kalima. Another example of that would be al-insan, right? Al-insan, right? You can say, so you have, you say Hamza insan, wa Abdul Latif insan, wa Yusr insan, wa Uthman insan, right? So there's the category and its particulars. The relationship kulli and juz'i. The second is حصر الكل في أجزائه. The second is the relationship between a whole and its parts. وضابطه أن يصح تحليل المقسم إلى أقسامه. And it's the criteria for a relationship between components is that you can break what is being divided into its parts. كما في حصر الحصير في السمسار والخيط. Right? Such as you could take a mat and break it into its component parts, which are the straw and the thread that's tying it together. Right? Or a chair has a seat, a back, and legs. Right? So you say al-kursi is a kul, and each leg, each qa'ima is one of its parts. The seat is a part. The back of the chair is a part. So يصح تحليله إليها, because you could break the whole into its parts, but you would not say and also, but can you say that the legs of a chair are the chair? No. That the back of the chair is the chair? No. And so on. Right? And the third category, والثالث حصر بمعنى عدم الخروج. The third is that something is divided into parts insofar as the thing being talked about does not, it's divided into them because of non-departure, that it is not other than these things. كما في قول الشخص انحصر حكم الأمير في البلد, that the ruling of the Amir is limited to this land. وانحصرت فكرتي في ذنوبي, and my thoughts were limited to my sins. Or better, my thoughts were limited to Allah's mercy and forgiveness. يا رب. بمعنى أن حكم الأمير لا يخرج عن البلد, in the sense that the ruling of the Amir does not leave this land. وأن فكرته لا تخرج عن ذنوبه, or his thoughts don't leave his sins, in the second case. Another example of this, right, is التقسيم للكلام في الأجرومية. Right? In the Ajurumiyya, for those of you who've studied it, right, what does he say? الكلام هو اللفظ المركب بالمفيد بالوضع وأقسامه ثلاثة. Its types are three. Right? What kind of taqsim is this? It's this third category. That ما يتألف منه الكلام لا يخرج عن كونه أحد ثلاث. That the things that speech is made up from do not depart being other than one of these three. Remember that? And this is discussed by al-Ashmawi in his Hashiya on the Ajurumiyya and by others. Which is why, to avoid this, in the Mutammimatul Ajurumiyya, what does he do? He defines kalam, and he defines after it, what does he define after it? The kalima, right? Because these are because the relationship between the kalima and the ism, fi'l and harf is that these are aqsam actually of ism, fi'l and harf. These are aqsam of the kalima, not of kalam, in a more direct way, which is the kalima is a mafhum kulli, and these are juz'iyat of it. Right? And of course, I would ignore some of the objections at the bottom, etc. You'll go all over the place. So Maulana al-Bajuri rahimahullah ta'ala says, وكلام المصنف رحمه الله لا يصح من قبيل الأول لعدم صحة الإخبار بالمقسم عن كل قسم من أقسامه، إذ لا يصح أن يقال الوجوب حكم عقلي، وكذا البقية، لأن الحكم العقلي إثبات أمر لأمر أو نفي عنه كما تقدم، ولا شيء من ذلك بوجوب ولا استحالة ولا جواز، فكيف يصح الإخبار به عن كل أحد منها. Right? So the words of the author that أقسامه ثلاثة, that the حكم العقلي are وجوب جواز وجوب استحالة جواز. It could not be from the division of the kulli and the juz'i, because you cannot refer to each of the particulars as with the with the name of the category, because wujub is not a hukm aqli, right? And likewise the others, because the hukm al-aqli is affirming a matter for another or negating it from it. And that is not what wujub is. Wujub is an affirmation, right? Is one affirmation. Wujub is a particular affirmation, right? Now there's a way around that some people say it's, you say it's, that yanqasim, and he mentions that, right? This bi'atibar al-mahkum bihi thalatha. But that's a separate issue. ولا من قبيل الثاني, and it's not a kull and it's أجزاء لعدم صحة تخليل المقسم إلى أقسامه, because you can't break down the thing being divided into these parts. إذ الوجوب والاستحالة والجواز ليست أجزاء للحكم العقلي, because necessity, absurdity, and permission are not parts of the hukm al-aqli. So you can't break it down into these. فَتَعَيَّنَ أَنْ يَكُونَ مِنْ قَبِيلِ الثَّالِثِ. So it's necessary that it be from the third category. وَالْمَعْنَى عَلَيْهِ أَنَّ الْحُكْمَ الْعَقْلِ لَا يَخْرُجْ عَنْ ثَلَاثَةِ أَقْسَامٍ. So the meaning would be that the rational ruling does not depart from being one of three. And Imam al-Bajuri adopted a way of brevity. He doesn't unpack the whole argument, right? So he's giving you the result of a lengthy argument. Those, to get a focused taste of it, but I wouldn't waste too much time on it, or I wouldn't spend too much time on it. Of the more accessible of the hawashi on you can look at the sharh of the author himself. Sometimes he brings up some of these matters. Number two is the sharh of al-Hudhudi with the Hashiya of al-Sharqawi. And we should put sharh al-Sanusi just on its own as a resource, properly named in Arabic. And it would just run by me which edition. Number two, the Hashiyat al-Sharqawi on Sharh al-Hudhudi, which has an old edition floating online. Those are accessible. Hashiyat al-Dasuqi is quite advanced, right? It's much more complex than Hashiyat al-Bajuri. So I wouldn't drown myself unless you have significantly more familiarity, but it can be quite testing. Like it needs someone who's quite familiar with the subject to really be able to benefit. So وحاول جماعة تصحيح كونه من قبيل الأول بوجوه. I said a group of scholars tried to rectify it as the relationship between the hukm al-aqli and wujub, jawaz, and istihala to be from the first category, right? The kulli and the juz'i, the relationship between the kulli and the juz'i, minha ma huwa ba'id, in a number of ways. One which is some which are far-fetched, wa minha ma huwa ghayru sadid, and others which are unsound. ولكن أحسنها, but the best of them على أنه على تقدير مضاف من قبيل قوله الوجوب وما بعده، والأصل إثبات الوجوب وإثبات الاستحالة وإثبات الجواز. And that there's something implicit, which is not necessity itself, but the affirmation of necessity, the affirmation of possibility, the affirmation of absurdity. وحينئذ صح كونه من قبيل الأول. In this way, it is fit to be from the first category. لوجود ضابطه فيه, because then the criteria of the division of the kulli into the juz'i, the criteria that he mentioned above, would apply. إذ يصح أن يقال إثبات الوجوب حكم عقلي, because affirmation of necessity is a rational ruling. Necessity is not a rational ruling. Affirming necessity is a rational ruling. وهكذا. فتدبر. So reflect on this. Right? And that, you know, but understanding this distinction between kulli and juz'i and kull and juz, you know, keeps coming up. It's a discussion that comes up in mantiq as well. But this is how much we're going to look at here, right? So you can conceptualize this in, you know, and it's good to diagram, right? Like the anwa' al-hasr, right? You need the kulli into its juz'iyat, the kull into its ajza', the dabit of each, and an example of each. And you can come up with several other examples, right? We mentioned the chair, yeah, and its parts, you know, the human being and individuals. Other categories, right? Animals. And then you have different types of animals. Each one you can refer to as an animal. So humans, donkeys, cows, sheep, goats, lions, hyenas, all of these are, what's the relationship between these? It's of kulli and juz'i. And something can be juz'iyyun lima fawqahu, kulliyyun lima tahtahu. Right? Right? So if you have a cat, you have levels of classification. So insan is a juz'i for hayawan, but it's a kulli with respect to the individual human beings under it. You say creation is living, non-living. You know, you can divide it. So you can have many levels of definition, right? So something can be juz'iyyun lima fawqahu. It can be a juz'i for what's above it, but a kulli for what's below it. Let's think it through. Okay. قوله الوجوب وهو عدم قبول الانتفاء. Right, so here, والاستحالة وهي عدم قبول الثبوت. قوله الجواز وهو قبولهما لكن على سبيل التناوب. Right, so Imam al-Bajuri slips in three alternate definitions, right, giving preference to those definitions over the definitions that will be coming up. Right? So he says necessity, and he gives a definition which is not accepting negation, and absurdity, which is not accepting affirmation, and possibility, al-jawaz, وهو قبولهما, which is accepting both, i.e. ثبوت and انتفاء, لكن على سبيل التناوب, but alternating or alternatingly, right? Such that one must be affirmed, but both cannot be affirmed. بمعنى قبول الثبوت تارة وقبول الانتفاء تارة أخرى لا على سبيل الاجتماع. Such that they accept either affirmation sometimes and negation at others, but not at the same time. إذ لا يمكن قبولهما معا, because it's not possible to accept both at once. Something cannot exist, something cannot be affirmed and negated at the same time. Right? So these three definitions he slips in here, right, as a prelude to addressing some of the ishkalat, some of the issues that arise with the definitions given by Imam al-Sanusi, and we'll look at why Imam al-Sanusi chose his definition as well. Now he gives some background to, right, to the issue. So he says, right, that وقدم الوجوب لشرفه وأعقبه بالاستحالة لأنها ضده وضد أقرب الأشياء خطورا بالبال عند ذكر ضده وأخر الجواز لأنه لم يبق له مرتبة إلا التأخير وأيضا فهو شبيه بالمركب وما قبله شبيه بالبسيط والمركب متأخر عن البسيط. So this is training the student to think, right? That the aqil is someone whose actions are principled, right? So he mentions the necessary first, because the necessary is more noble, because that's what is affirmed about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then he mentions the absurdity next, because it's the opposite. And the opposite is the closest of matters that occurs to the mind, khuturan ay fil khatir, and that occurs to the mind when the opposite is mentioned. And tu'rafu al-umur bi-adadiha, things are also known by their opposites. And he mentions the possibility last because no other place remains, number one, and also because possibility resembles something composite, right? And the murakkab, and that which is made up of parts, comes after its parts. Then he makes a clarification, right? That وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْوُجُوبَ بِذَلِكَ الْمَعْنَى هُوَ الْمُرَادُ فِي عِلْمِ التَّوْحِيدِ مَتَى أُطْلِقَ. Know well that wujub in this meaning is what is meant in the science of divine oneness, in aqaid, when it is mentioned unconditionally. It says such and such is wajib, meaning لا يقبل الانتفاء. Such and such thing is necessary. This wajib is a aqlan, right? Because the primary concern of the theologians are أحكام العقل. ما يجب وما يجوز وما يستحيل عقلا, right? So that إلا في نحو قولهم يجب على كل مكلف أن يعرف إلى آخره فهو بالمعنى المشهور وهو كون الشيء بحيث يثاب على فعله ويعاقب على تركه, right? Except in the like of their saying, it is necessary for the morally responsible person to know. There, the wajib, the necessity, is a legal necessity. And that's where the common, the widespread meaning of necessity, of wajib, which is al-wajib al-shar'i. But it's understood contextually, right? Because mukallaf, taklif, is with what? With the hukum shar'i. So the context makes it clear that when we're talking about taklif relates to hukum shar'i, right? Or where context makes clear that something is normatively true, right? And he defines necessity, that necessity legally is for something to be such that the one who does it is rewarded and the one who leaves it is punished. يعاقب. ففرق بين أن يقال يجب لله كذا وأن يقال يجب على المكلف كذا. So there's a complete difference between us saying it is necessary for Allah, to exist, for example, because meaning it's rationally necessary. يعني لا يقبل الانتفاء. It cannot not be. And are saying that it is necessary for the morally responsible person to do such and such, meaning it is legally necessary. So they're completely distinct, so there's no comparison, right? ولا تكن ممن اشتبه عليه الأمر فقال ما لا محصل له. So don't be of those who got confused by this matter. So they said things that have no result. Right? So here, you need to know clearly the definition of the hukm al-aqli and wujub, istihala and jawaz, their definitions. And we'll be looking slightly further into the wajib. Wujub is dhati and aradi, and istihala is dhatiya and aradiyya, and we'll see that in a bit. Okay, so then he says, then he talks about the wajib. قوله فالواجب إلى آخره. So he gives the definition of the wajib. You can read the definition of the wajib itself from the text of the Sanusiyya. أي إذا أردت بيان كل من هذه الأمور الثلاثة فالواجب إلى آخره فالفاء للإفصاح لا للتفريع. Right? So Imam al-Bajuri says, so the necessary, right? Says, meaning what is implicit here in the language, because there's different types of fa. Right? Because you can mention something in summary and then make tafri' of it. Right? This is called fa'ut tafri'. But this fa al-fasiha, right, which is lil-ifsah, which وإفصاح عن وهي تفصح عن سؤال مقدر. Right? The فاء تفصيح, right, is the فاء of making explicit. It explicitly responds to an implicit question. Right? That if you seek to know what these three matters that the hukm al-aqli is divided into, then the necessary is such and such. So the fa is of ifsah la lit-tafri'a. And again, Imam al-Bajuri is giving you the summary of a lengthy discussion that's taken place amongst specifically the commentators and ashab al-hawashi on the Sanusiyya and other works where this discussion came. And the one who wants to work hard could go and look up fa al-fasiha versus fa al-tafri'a, but that relates to issues of language, and you'll get there when you get there. فَإِنْ قِيلَ. So then there's a couple of objections, right? كان المناسب للمصنف أن يعرف كلا من الوجوب والاستحالة والجواز لا كلا من الواجب والمستحيل والجائز، لأنه ذكر أولا الوجوب وأخويه دون الواجب وأخويه، فقد ذكر شيئا ولم يعرفه وعرف شيئا ولم يذكره. This is an objection. So he details the objection. That couldn't it be said that it would have been more appropriate for the author to define necessity, absurdity, and permissibility, not the necessary, the impossible, the necessary, the wajib, the mustahil, and the possible, because he first mentioned necessity and the other two, necessity, absurdity, and possibility. He did not mention first the necessary, the absurd, and the possible. So he mentioned something and didn't define it, and then he defined something that he hadn't mentioned. Ujib. The response is بأنه استغنى بتعريف الواجب وأخويه عن تعريف الوجوب وأخويه. That he did not have need to define the necessary and its two associated terms, meaning the necessary, the absurd, and the possible. He استغنى بتعريف, by defining the necessary, the possible, and the impossible. He did not need to define necessity, absurdity, and possibility. لأن الواجب مشتق من الوجوب, because the necessary is derived from necessity, and so on. ومعرفة المشتق تستلزم معرفة المشتق منه, because knowing the derived necessarily entails knowing what it is derived from, لأنه جزءه, because it is a part of it. إذ الواجب أمر موصوف بالوجوب, because the necessary is a matter characterized by necessity, and so on. This is an elegant response. So Imam al-Sanusi says, الواجب ما لا يتصور في العقل ثبوته. Correct? عفوا ما لا يتصور في العقل عدمه. استغفر الله. The necessary is that which is not conceivable to the intellect to be non-existent. Right? says قوله ما لا يتصور بضم الباء مبني لما لم يسمى فاعله بمعنى لا يدرك. Right? لا يتصور cannot be conceived. Right? You say this not really here, we're not talking about tasawwur, because tasawwur you can imagine. Tasawwur can refer to imagination. You can imagine anything. Right? So that's one of the objections. That the word tasawwur, imagine. Right? People imagine a pantheon of gods. But he's saying tasawwur here is not in this meaning of tasawwur. It's not in the idea of tasawwur of imagining something, right? Because could a sound intellect imagine a pantheon of gods? Just merely imagining? Yes. But بمعنى لا يدرك. Right? Right? ما لا, that which is not affirmed. Right? That the mind would not affirm. أو بفتحها. Right? مبنيا للفاعل. Right? بمعنى لا يمكن. لا يتصور في العقل عدمه. Right? Meaning that the mind would not affirm the possibility of. واعترض بأن الواجب قد يتصور في العقل عدمه. And there's an objection, of course not sound, that the wajib could be imagined in the intellect to not exist. Someone could imagine someone could imagine God not to exist. It's necessary. Someone could imagine that. إذ العقل قد يتصور المحال, because the intellect could imagine the absurd. أجيب بأن المراد بالتصور هنا التصديق. The response is that what is meant here by tasawwur is not imagining, but tasdeeq, but affirming and accepting, i.e. soundly. بمعنى الإذعان والقبول, such as one accepts and surrenders to that truth. Then of course there's another aspect which will come, that fil aql, by the intellect, we're talking about the sound intellect, which is an intellect that is unobstructed by that which impairs sound function, and that operates according to sound principles of thinking. Or we're not talking about a specific intellect, We're talking about the intellect as a category. And that's coming up. وَدَخَلَ فِي التَّعْرِيفِ كُلٌّ مِنَ الْوَاجِبِ الضَّرُورِ وَالْوَاجِبُ النَّظَرِ. And in the definition, we have both what is intuitively necessary, the wajib al-daruri, and that wal-wajib al-nazari, and that which is necessary upon reflection. وَالْأَوَّلُ هُوَ مَا لَا يَحْتَاجُ إِلَى نَظَرٍ وَاسْتِدْلَالٍ. And the intuitively necessary is that which does not require reason and, nazar, which is reasoning or thinking, and istidlal, and reasoning. كالتحيز للجرم بمعنى أخذه قدرا من الفراغ الموهوم, such as a body taking up space. تحيز للجرم. Jirm is a body. ما تركب من جوهرين فأكثر. The jirm is a body that was made up of two or more parts. That a body taking up space, meaning taking up an extent of imagined emptiness. And this is, and he talks about, is there actual emptiness or is there imagined emptiness? And they discuss that with respect to the universe. Is there actual emptiness or it's imagined emptiness? We don't observe anything there. And of course, that's not a matter, that's not a theological matter, right? Right? So the theologian's description of creation is that's not the purpose of theology, right? That's just describing so that one can reason with people we want to affirm that the world, that all of this is originated, created. Right? That's all we want to get to with those we talked about the world to. Okay. والثاني ما يحتاج إلى ذلك, and the second, which is the wajib al-nazari, which is the necessary that requires consideration or reflection, that requires thinking. وما يحتاج إلى is that which requires this reasoning, thinking and reasoning. كقدرة الله تعالى, such as affirming power for Allah. You have to think about it. وكذا سائر ما ذكر في هذا الفن. And likewise, most of what is mentioned in this science, it requires thinking. Which is why, when minds become weak or affected by all kinds of things, then muqaddimat are needed. First, we have to cover some background topics in order to gain clarity with respect to how to think soundly. Right? So that's what's meant. ما لا يتصور. Tasawwur here doesn't have the meaning of imagining, because you can imagine the absurd. But rather, tasawwur in the definition has the meaning of the mind would not affirm, right? Right? Affirm and accept as true, right? Right? Then there's another objection, right? لا يقال كيف يكون تحيز الجرم واجبا مع أنه مسبوق بعدم ويلحقه عدم. One does not say that how could a body taking up space be necessary even though it is preceded by non-existence and non-existence, عدم, comes after it. لأننا نقول المراد أنه واجب عند وجود الجرم, because we say that it is necessary if the body exists. That if a body exists, it is necessarily characterized by taking up space. Because that is the only meaning of a body. وَلِذَا يُسَمَّى وَاجِبًا مُقَيَّدًا. This is why this kind of necessity is called conditional necessity. وَأَمَّا الْوَاجِبُ الْمُطْلَقِ, as for unconditional necessity, right? فَكَذَاتِهِ تَعَالَى وَصِفَاتِهِ. That is like Allah's entity. It is always necessary because it always exists. وَصِفَاتِهِ, and Allah's attributes, which are, their wujub is mutlaq. And here, if you have been reviewing, there is discussion about, in Imam al-Sawi, about some of the theologians who affirmed otherwise, and how that is a highly objectionable discussion. وَكُلٌّ مِّنْ هَذَيْنِ النَّوْعَيْنِ, and each of these two categories, وَاجِبٌ لِذَاتِهِ, each of these two categories are intrinsically necessary. وَهُنَاكَ وَاجِبٌ لِغَيْرِهِ, and this is all wajib aradi. And then there is that which is extrinsically necessary, وَإِنْ يعني وَهُوَ وَإِنْ كَانَ جَائِزًا فِي ذَاتِهِ, and the wajib لِغَيْرِهِ, that which is extrinsically necessary, is that which, though in itself possible, is extrinsically necessary. واجب وجوبا عرضيا لتعلق علم الله تعالى به. It is extrinsically necessary because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge related to it. Right? كوجود شيء من الممكنات, like anything of existing things. في زمن علم الله وجوده فيه. Anything of the possible. During the time that Allah knows that this thing will exist, during the time of its existence, it is contingently, we say wajib li ghayrihi or wajib aradi. It's from the possible. It's merely possible. Like your existence right now. Right? What's your existence? In of itself, it's mumkin. But while you exist, it is contingently necessary. It's wajibun li ghayrihi. Why? Wajibun li ta'alluqi ilmi Allahi ta'ala bi wujudik. It's necessary because Allah's knowledge related to this possible thing existing contingently during that time. وهذه الأنواع تجري في المستحيل. And these categories, so there's a مستحيل المطلق and the مستحيل المقيد. There's a مستحيل ذاتي and مستحيل لغيره. فالمستحيل الذاتي المطلق كالشريك. That which is intrinsically absurd, unconditionally, is like the partner for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. والمقيد, and the conditionally absurd, is كعدم تحيز الجرم. And the contingently absurd, or the limited absurd, is a body not taking up space. If a body were to exist, it is absurd for it to not take up space. It's mustahil. But the body itself doesn't have to be there, so it is not right now, because if it doesn't exist, it doesn't take up space, correct? وَالْعَرَضِيُّ, and so here, this is where he refers to it above as لِغَيْرِهِ, and here he refers to it as عَرَضِي. You can refer back in the slides to the diagram. And the مستحيل العرضي and the contingently absurd كوجود شيء من الممكنات في زمن علم الله عدمه فيه فتدبر. And the contingently absurd is the existence of anything possible at a time when Allah knew that it would not be. So someone's sitting there imagining that I could be in Rawalpindi Sharif. So let's say that Sidi Abdul Latif's dream was to go to Rawalpindi. I don't know why you'd want to go to Rawalpindi necessarily, though no disrespect to Rawalpindi. My mother grew up there. Right? At this moment, what is the ruling of you being in Rawalpindi, Sidi Abdul Latif? Actually, assuming that you are still in Washington State.
It's absurd.
Yeah, but what kind of absurdity? It's mustahil aradi. It's in itself possible, but contingently, this is what's called aradi, wujud aradi, wujub aradi, or mustahil aradi, wajib aradi, or mustahil aradi. So if we go back to the diagram, right? 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 So you have, right? The wajib is dhati, intrinsically necessary, right? Which is that which does not accept ما لا يقبل الانتفاء في ذاته. The wujub al-aradi is, for example, at this moment for you to be in Washington State is in itself possible, but given that Allah's knowledge related to its being affirmed during the time you are in Washington, and then of course whatever Allah knows will be is specified by His will eternally and originated by His power in the context of time. That is wajib wujuban aradiyan. It's contingently necessary. So what is could never have been otherwise. And that has theological implications. ما أصابك لم يكن ليخطئك, as the Prophet ﷺ said. Whatever hits you was never going to miss. وما أخطأك لم يكن ليصيبك. And whatever missed you was never going to hit. And this is the reality affirmed in hadith of Ibn Abbas. لو أن الأمة اجتمعوا على أن ينفعوك بشيء يضروك بشيء أو ينفعوك, like both aspects of it, to benefit you in anything or to harm you. They could not benefit you except in something Allah recorded for you. They couldn't harm you except in something Allah recorded against you. Right? So that's the mustahil al-arabi, the contingently impossible, is that anything be at a time where Allah knows that it will not be. And that relates to the words of Imam al-Ghazali that some misconstrued, which is لَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَبْدَعُ مِمَّا كَانَ. There is nothing in possibility more perfect than what is. Right? Because what is at any moment in contingent existence is contingently necessary. It could never have been otherwise, because it relates to the eternal knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَتَدَبَّرْ. So reflect on that. So that is the and the reason to raise these objections is to train the mind to think a little bit. And then he mentions the intellect, fil aql. Right? Fil aql. So he says, قوله في العقل. Right? He's saying in the intellect. Right? يحتمل أن ال فيه للعهد. One of the possibilities is that the al here is referential. وَالْمَعْهُودِ الْفَرْدُ الْكَامِلِ. It is the complete particular. وَيَحْتَمِلُ أَنَّهَا لِلْإِسْتِغْرَاقِ. And it's possible that it be encompassing. وَعَلَيْهِ فَهُوَ شَامِلٌ لِكُلِّ عَقْلٍ. And in this way, it would appear to in all intellects. لكن بقطع النظر عن العلائق المانعة من ذلك. But in a manner that does not but in a manner that does not consider what prevents sound reason. كالشبه التي تقوم بعقل الفرق الضالة, such as the confusions that affect the misguided sects. فاندفع بذلك ما قد يقال. And this either way would ward off what could be said, إنه قد يتصور في بعض العقول عدم بعض الواجبات. So this would ward off what could be said, that some of the intellects could conceive of the non-existence of some of the necessary. كعقل المعتزلة, such as the intellects of the Mu'tazila. فإنه قد يتصور فيه عدم القدرة ونحوها من صفات الله تعالى, من صفات المعاني, because they conceive of the non-existence of power and other of the affirmative attributes. But he says, نعم يرد أن الواجب واجب في نفسه. But there is an objection that the necessary is in itself necessary. وجد عقل أم لم يوجد, whether there is an intellect or not. وكذا المستحيل والجائز. Likewise, the absurd is absurd in of itself, whether there is an intellect there to affirm it or not. And likewise the possible. فكان الأولى أن لا يربط التعريف الثلاثة بالعقل. So it would have been better in of itself that he not connect the definition of the wajib, the mustahil, and the jaiz with the intellect. كان يقول, such as by defining it by saying الواجب ما لا يقبل الانتفاء, that the necessary is that which does not affirm, that which does not accept negation. والمستحيل ما لا يقبل الثبوت. And the absurd is that which does not affect, the mustahil is that which does not accept affirmation. والجائز ما يقبلهما, and the possible is that which accepts both affirmation and negation. Right? So the answer is that the purpose here is to highlight the role of, right? Because we study Aqidah not in the abstract sense, but we study Aqidah as servants of God who are morally responsible, and the manatu taklif al-aql, and the basis of moral responsibility is the intellect. Right? So there's a benefit in mentioning the basis of reason, but also to mention the intellect, because sometimes you want to not mention the intellect, to mention the thing in of itself. So you need to know both definitions, because in itself, there's these definitions. The necessary in itself is this. The absurd is this. The possible is this. But when you want to highlight the need to think right and your responsibility, then you want to mention the intellect, because you may want to highlight that what is the nature of the intellect? What is sound reason? You want to distinguish between the normative and the rational. You need to mention the intellect, right, in some contexts. So Imam al-Sanusi mentioned the intellect purposefully. Okay, we're going to stop here at the discussion of the definition of the intellect, and we have or we'll read this and stop بإذن الله تعالى. He says رحمة الله تعالى عليه وقد وقع لهم في حد العقل تعريف كثيرة. The scholars presented many different definitions for the intellect. أحسنها, the best of them, and this one you should memorize, أنه نور روحاني به تدرك النفس العلوم الضرورية والنظرية. Right? That it is a spiritual light by which the self knows the intuitive and acquired knowledge. Al-Daruri, which is that which is intuitive, does not require reflection, and the nadari, that which requires reason and reflection. واستفيد من هذا التعريف أن المدرك في الحقيقة هي النفس. And from this definition, we understand that the basis of cognition, of idrak, is the self. وإنما العقل آلة في الإدراك, and the intellect is a tool for cognition. كسائر القوة, like all other capacities. ولذلك قال ابن قاسم في آياته, and that's why Ibn Qasim said in his work الآيات, آيات البينات, اتفق المحققون على أن المدرك للكليات والجزئيات هي النفس الناطقة. Right? That Ibn Qasim al-Abbadi, is it al-Abbadi? No, it's another. Yeah, Ibn Qasim al-Baghdadi. Here you can see the biography. Distinguished Shafi'i and theologian. That the scholars of verification agree, meaning generally, that what recognizes, what comes to know the kulliyat, right, categories and particulars, is the self, is the discerning self. وأن نسبة الإدراك إلى قواها كنسبة القطع إلى السكين. And the relationship of acquisition of knowledge to its capacities is like the relationship of cutting to the knife, that they are means. انتهى. وبهذا كله ظهر أن في هنا سببية. Right? And from this we understand that the fi in the definition is for sababiyya, for cause, by means of. فَتَأَمَّل. So reflect on this. So here, inshallah, the intellect, he gives one key definition, right? That it's a spiritual light by which the human self knows intuitive and acquired knowledge, right? There are a bunch of other definitions, and this is worth, for those who would like to read further, in Imam Ghazali's Book of Knowledge, there's a chapter on the sharaf al-aql, the merit of the intellect, and the definitions of the intellect, and he breaks down the intellect into parts. And we're going to begin by looking at a couple of things related to that. So from the Book of Knowledge, there's some discussion. It's a little nuanced, but it's of benefit bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And there's also, of course, Imam al-Ghazali uses that to look at what is practical intelligence and beneficial intelligence. So we look at some of the related definitions as well, because there is the intellect is a tool of discernment. It's alatu tamyiz. It's the tool for distinguishing. But you can distinguish without benefit. And you can distinguish, driven by lusts. You can distinguish driven by whim. You can distinguish just for the sake of distinguishing, but you can distinguish towards the pleasure of Allah. You can also distinguish towards the presence of Allah. So there's levels of distinguishing. So I gathered a handout with a number of related readings, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We'll touch upon a couple of them to begin next week, and then we'll look at the absurd. So it says, قوله وعدمه الضمير عائد على ما باعتبار الأفراد كالقدرة والإرادة لا باعتبار المفهوم الكلي كما هو ظاهر. Right? And then he says, قوله المستحيل. Then he'll give us the definition of the absurd and the possible. And then there's a few objections. They'll be relatively clear. And then we look at what is necessary for Allah subhanahu. So he says it's necessary for every morally responsible person to. So he gives us the definition of who is morally responsible and a number of discussions related to that. Shar'an, through sacred law, and ya'rifa, to know. Right? It's necessary for the one morally responsible. So we look at, there's a legal obligation for the morally responsible person. So we look at the definition of the morally responsible and the issue of ahl al-fatra, those whom the message did not reach, to know. Right? And we look at the definition of ilm and how it contrasts with ma'rifah. What is necessary, possible, and absurd for our Master, mighty and majestic. And to know the like for with respect to his prophets. And then he said, so we'll look at that, and then the lesson after we'll get to the discussion of the divine attributes. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. So we'll stop here for today. If there are questions, you can ask them on the forum, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and we can address them in time for next week.